Hello and welcome to today's Girl Talk, Girl Up's virtual event series. I'm Madina, Senior Program Associate at Girl Up, and I am pleased that you have joined us today for a very important topic. This month's discussion is titled Putting Resistance into Practice and Taking Action to Combat Gender-Based Violence. Before we continue, I'd like to emphasize that we'll be discussing a serious topic, a topic that warrants everyone's attention, but might also be triggering and difficult at times. We will primarily focus on information and understandings to help us take action to combat gender-based violence. Girl Up leaders have been engaging in many different ways in their communities to combat gender-based violence. They have created safe spaces, launched media campaigns, managed events featuring expert speakers, and engaged with community leaders to raise awareness. And that's only naming a few of the things they've done. Throughout the session, we'll pose some questions to continue shedding light on the topic, and we'll also hear directly from two guest speakers as they engage in fireside chats with our very own Girl Up leaders. So you'll see some poll questions throughout the session. Feel free to respond to them, and we'll refer to those poll questions throughout as well. Throughout the session, feel free to also engage in the chat to share your thoughts and ideas. While the topic of gender-based violence is pressing and important, I'm also pleased to point you all to the Getting Involved section of this platform for resources, including Girl Up's enhanced curriculum titled Let's Talk About Gender-Based Violence, Building Awareness and Solidarity, which we've launched today, so please make sure you don't miss it. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Giordana and Nicolette Naylor. Giordana is an Andean Peruvian changemaker who leads the Girl Up Peru Coalition, Women d'Or Society, and Codecting. She is an advocate for girls' rights and recently participated in the Generation Equality Forum. Giordana takes action and engages in activism because she believes that together we can be the change the world needs. You'll see Giordana along with Nicolette Naylor. Nicolette started her career as a South African human rights lawyer practicing law in the commercial, human rights, and public interest law arena in South Africa and London. At the Women's Legal Center, a public interest law center in South Africa, she litigated key test cases involving child sexual abuse, rape, and sexual harassment. She joined the Ford Foundation in 2007, and she currently serves as the International Program Director, Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice, responsible for directing the Ford Foundation's global programming on gender, racial, and ethnic justice, managing a diverse team across India, West Africa, South Africa, and Latin America. Nicolette and Giordana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madina, for the introduction. And also thanks for the invitation to us. It's a pleasure to drive this session. Hi, everyone. I'm Gio, Girl Up Peru coalition leader who's run as our she and her and a feminist advocate to youth empowerment. Growing up surrounded by sexual harassment in school classes have taught me that we all share the responsibility to end violence about girls and women. This commitment can only succeed with strong advocacy and support to the survivors. As the head of Girl Up Peru, I help organize multiple crowdfunding and charity campaigns to support low-income girls who experience gender-based violence in Lima, Peru. So as you can see, there are a variety of different interventions aimed to eliminating gender-based violence. For example, as I previously mentioned, awareness campaigns for raising charity events. Now, Nicolette, I have a question for you. Could you describe some of the areas of focus and explain why a variety of these interventions and approach exist rather than just one?
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a great honor to be in conversation with you, and that's a great question. I think the persistence of gender-based violence is a complex issue, and that's why we need multi-pronged approaches to eliminate it. And I think the first point, a couple of points to make. Firstly, gender-based violence and gender inequality are two sides of the same coin. It's the cause and a consequence of gender inequality. And violence is one of the starkest ways that the patriarchy asserts itself in our lives and tries to put us in our place. So we have to start by addressing gender inequality. Gender inequality is key in our analysis and in the way we're approaching the issue. Secondly, we often talk about prevention and response when it comes to gender-based violence. We must work at both ends. We must work to prevent gender-based violence before it starts, but we must also find more effective ways of responding to violence after it has occurred, so that we're protecting the rights of survivors. And we know that when we're talking about the rights of survivors of violence, we're talking about access to justice. We're talking about psychosocial support, addressing the criminal justice system and impunity. And the laws and policies are necessary, but that's not enough to eliminate gender-based violence. So our advocacy and our work on the legal front is just one aspect. If I take an example from South Africa, where I am, we have some of the most progressive laws on gender-based violence that centers survivors, but our rates of violence remain very high. And so the laws and policies haven't always helped us to shift the norms and how men view women in society. So we have to start working at that societal norms level. And challenge the norms that allow girls and women to be seen as inferior or unequal to men and boys. And this is where our strategies have to look at prevention. And it's both. It's not one or the other. And last but not least, I think we have to hear from those closest to the ground, those most affected by violence. We have to put survivors at the center. And their experiences have to inform our responses. And we have to adapt our responses to what survivors need. And survivors aren't monolithic. Survivors are different. And we have to address the intersectional forces at play when we look at survivors and gender-based violence. So let me stop there. I've said a lot.
No, I mean you mentioned really important points. Like you gave us like a big picture, considering us like legal factors, social factors, cultural factors, and even psychological factors. You know, like survivors being more empowered so they can also overcome this situation. And I just like listen important, like a key term called intersectionality. And yeah, my next question is also regarding to this. As we know, like most of these proposals are from the general big picture, right? But also it's important to consider the perspective from the survivors, right? So yeah, intersectionality is about fighting discrimination between discrimination, tackling inequalities between inequalities, and protecting minorities as minorities. It examines the ways in which experience and discrimination are compounded by peoples in multiple marginalized groups as ones. Taking an intersectionality approach allows social justice leaders to focus on social informed by the experience and voices of these women. Nicolette, what is the value of intersectionality in understanding gender-based violence?
Another great question, Giordana. I always think about intersectionality in terms of, if you picture a four-way stop, picture a busy road, a busy intersection wherever you are in the world. And I'm standing in the middle of that intersection. I'm standing there as a Black, heterosexual, middle-class, 46-year-old woman from South Africa. I come into that space as my whole self. You can't cut off the gender piece from the race piece, from the global South African piece. I experience the world, and my lived reality is based on my whole self. and how I experience violence and discrimination is influenced by all of that. I think the words of Audre Lorde, we don't live single issue lives. And so intersectionality allows us to consider how violence affects women differently and how we hold our different identities, whether it's age, disability, class, race, gender. And if we want to make inroads into preventing and responding to violence, we must first understand how women and girls experience violence. That's what survivor-centered approaches demand of us. And overlapping identities often increase our risk of experiencing violence. And it can also compound how we experience violence. So if you take a Black lesbian woman that is targeted for rape because she is Black and lesbian, that's where her overlapping identities has increased the risk of experiencing violence, and it will also compound the impact of the violence. So an intersectional frame allows us to bring the experiences of women and girls who often remain at the margins to the center, who's often overlooked, whether it's the trans girl, the young girl with disability, non-binary young people. And I think that's why we have to start looking at, I've learned a lot from learning from girl-centered organizations, groups of girls with disabilities who have said our experience of violence is very different from other girls' experience of violence. And the response that we need is a different response. So we have to start tailoring our responses to those needs. And I think the last point I'll make about this is intersectionality is not just a theory. We must apply it in practice and start to say and interrogate ourselves and keep asking ourselves, who is on the margins? Are we generalizing about survivors all being the same when we look at our gender-based violence interventions? Are we always starting from an assumption of someone living in an urban area, that's a particular race, that's a particular age? How are we adapting our interventions and asking ourselves, who's really invisible here? How does nationality play in? How does disability play in? How does race play in? And I think that's when we get to be really effective. Let me stop there.
Yeah, definitely. I love the approaches and also the nuances that you brought up. You mentioned, like, for example, factors as race, ability, language, sexual orientation, nationality, age, culture, even gender identity. So yeah, it's pretty interesting how everything interconnects in only one big factor. And also it's more interesting how people from these different communities, for example, like trans people, gay people, queers, and even like people with disabilities broke their own collectives to fight for gender equality. So this is really aligned with our next question. And as we know, protest movements have sprung around up the world to end violence. Some of these have largely taken place online. For example, like "And All Be No One Left Behind," or as we know here in Spanish, "No Dejemos a Nadie Atrás," Me Too movement, which evolved into a global movement, and others in person, like performances of the Chilean protest song against gender-based violence, which we saw in different places. So, Nicolette, what does this protest suggest about the power of movement building?
Can I just start by talking about the song that emanated out of Chile? I think calling out victim blaming, the role of the state, the judges, the president, patriarchy. It gave me goosebumps in South Africa, and I don't speak Spanish. And for me, the hashtag Me Too movement, I think, is the power of saying Me Too. An individual woman is actually making herself part of a broader group, a collective. I think that's also powerful, where it's not just about the individual, but it's you choosing to stand with others. And this solidarity is powerful. I come from a time, I'm old already, I come from a time when it was rare that we saw such a connection across geographies, where a song, a movement could cross borders and across geographies, where women and girls could identify uh, with a collective harm, where women and girls are saying their suffering is, they've all been harmed by the same forces of patriarchy and misogyny, and we're demanding that it be defeated. And so I think protest as transnational, and that making, connecting our experiences across geographies, that's been very powerful. And I think you can see the interconnectedness of our struggles across borders. And I love the fact that there's a younger generation, like your generation, that's coming into play, that's not just going to keep quiet, that are in your face saying, no more, we're demanding change now. And I think that's how change happens. Change happens when grassroots movements at community level start demanding change, and you have a ripple effect, and that power builds up when that community forms alliances and networks with another community across borders, and you have that ripple effect. And so the last point I'll make here is that protest movements, we've seen with COVID, we've seen online, offline movement building going hand in hand and complementing each other. And I think that is important. We have to be taking our activism into our surrounding communities and not just thinking about our activism online. But the two coming together are really powerful in terms of what you do physically in your own community and then taking it into an online platform. So that's what's been exciting for me about this.
Yeah, definitely. It's really important, to be this chain of change, inspire and get inspired in this way. Like we can have this global string with empowerments to drive the change in their own communities and countries. So yeah, really powerful remark. And yeah, you're currently served as International Program Director for Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice at the Ford Foundation. However, you have extensive experience working toward gender equity. What is one takeaway or lesson you would like to share with our viewers today about taking action to address such a widespread problem like gender-based violence? And what advice do you have for young, passionate changemakers who want to address gender-based violence both locally and globally?
I think you ask good questions. I think never underestimate the power of your own activism and your own power. It always starts with one person and grows into a movement. So believe in yourself, support each other, because this is a long haul challenge. There's no quick fix solutions here. Keep doing that power analysis, asking yourselves who's on the margin, who's invisible, how am I navigating my own power? Because the patriarchy, white supremacy often work hand in hand to divide us and split our movements and our solidarity. And so I think you need to be aware of this and grapple with the hard questions of what solidarity looks like and what solidarity feels like. The solidarity should never just be one size fits all, one strategy applies to everyone. GBV is a global phenomenon, but it requires solutions that are context specific and that builds on what we're learning. And I think to end off my advice for all of you out there that are very passionate about this issue, keep doing the good work that you're doing. I think keep doing the locating your struggles in a broader political analysis of inequality and build those alliances. And build alliances across movements with other movements, racial justice movements, indigenous movements, disability movements. And the last thing I'll say is you don't need to be superwoman. We all know that the personal is the political. We come into the gender-based violence space because of our own personal experiences of violence and trauma. And we carry that with us. And that makes this work powerful, but it also makes it very hard. So you need to embed your activism within a political understanding of healing and well-being, where you talk about trauma and you talk about the impact of trauma on all of us collectively, and we work to heal ourselves as we do this work. Don't do this work in a way that you sacrifice your own healing. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned in over 20 years of doing this work, because the pain and trauma is not out there, it's inside all of us as we do this work. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely you mentioned some pretty interesting points. For example, also care about us, well, no, like grow inside while we helping others to grow outside. And you'll also like arouse many questions. And yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about gender-based balance, gender equity, what feminism is, but there is only one truth applicable to all countries, cultures, and community. Violence against women is never acceptable, never excusable, and never tolerable. Gender-based violence isn't only a girls' or women's issue, it's a human issue, and we must stand up for humans' rights and security, right? Because the present belongs to the freedom and not the fear. So I will pass now to Madina, and thank you so much, Nicolette, for the insightful opinions and ideas.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you both. Thank you, Giordana and Nicolette, both of you, for your insights and for that conversation. There were certainly several points that resonated with me. I wrote a couple of them in the chat. I hope that as we go through this Girl Talk, viewers, you will do the same. And I'd like to emphasize just one point that Nicolette made specifically, which was that change happens when grassroots movements demand change and create connections across communities. So thank you both for that conversation. What I'll do now is introduce one of our poll questions. So the first poll question that you'll see is blank women globally experience violence. So think about your answer to that blank in the sentence, whether it's 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 12, or 1 in 25. And so you'll see that poll question. Think about the correct answer for that question. And a majority of you got it correct. It is unfortunately 1 in 3, and 1 in 3 is too many. That number should be 0. But unfortunately, it is not. We'll move on to our next poll question before we introduce our next speaker. And that is, as rates of gender-based violence have increased because of the COVID-19 pandemic, calls to helplines have blank in some countries. So have these calls decreased? Have they remained the same? Have they doubled? Or have they increased 5-fold? Have they increased by 5 times? So think about your answer to this prompt now, and whether it's that calls have decreased, remained the same, doubled, or increased 5-fold. And we have a 50-50 split, it looks like, but some of you are changing your answers, adding your answers. The correct answer, again, unfortunately, is that calls have increased 5-fold. And we'll end with just one more question before moving on, one more true or false statement. So you'll see the next poll statement, which is at least 155 countries have passed laws on domestic violence, and 140 have laws on sexual harassment in the workplace. So think about whether you believe this statement is true or false, and submit your answer in the poll. As you have done with the last 2 statements, you can think about whether this statement is true, whether it is false, whether you believe more countries have passed laws on domestic violence or fewer countries have passed laws on domestic violence. And let's see the results. A majority of our viewers have submitted the response that yes, it is true. So this is a glimmer of hope. At least 155 countries have passed laws on domestic violence. These laws do exist. And I thank you for your participation and for your responses to those prompts. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Priscilla and Erin Kenny. Priscilla is a Girl Up leader in India. She is an undergraduate student of political science from Manipur. Priscilla has a keen interest in studying various social issues through a gendered lens, and we'll hear from her and Erin Kenny. Erin Kenny is the head of the technical unit and senior advisor to the United Nations European Union Spotlight Initiative to eliminate violence against women and girls. Erin has 25 years of experience addressing violence against women, nearly all of which have focused on humanitarian and fragile contexts. Prior to assuming her current position, Erin was a team leader in UNFPA's humanitarian division, overseeing their work on addressing gender-based violence in emergencies. Before joining the UN, Erin worked in East and West Africa, the former Yugoslavia, and Southeast Asia, with a number of non-governmental organizations and foundations, including the International Rescue Committee, Child Fund International, Engender Health, Save the Children, the Women's Refugee Commission, and the Open Society Foundation. So I'll open the floor up to Priscilla and Erin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Priscilla Thangjam, and I'm a member of Girl Up Manipur. Gender-based violence is a very personal topic for a lot of us, and it is the same for me. Manipuri women face gender-based violence due to the draconian Armed Forces Special Powers Act. The infamous rape and murder case of Thangjam Manorama made a lot of people aware about how women's bodies are being violated by the armed forces. Manorama's story isn't just a story or a news headline to me. Manorama and the countless other women are women from my community, and that is why I feel that it is very important for me to combat gender-based violence through advocacy, and I'm so glad that I'm able to join this platform today. I hope that today's Girl Talk will help in furthering the conversation about gender-based violence and help in also effectively eliminating it in the future. On that note, thank you so much, Erin, for joining us today. Can you tell us a bit about your work with the Spotlight Initiative for those in the audience that might not be familiar?
Thanks so much, Priscilla. It's really great to be here with you, and you are incredibly inspiring in your advocacy and what you're doing. I just want to celebrate you for a second. I work with the Spotlight Initiative. It is a global effort led by the United Nations and the European Union to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. It's part of the Sustainable Development Goals, so it's really connected to this idea of the necessity of eradicating violence in order to achieve all of the other Sustainable Development Goals, so to ensure universal health care, to diminish poverty, et cetera. And the thing that often makes the most headlines about the initiative is it's a deep investment. We have 500 million euros of initial funding that allows us to do these really big investments in countries around the world, recognizing that these piecemeal efforts, so these kind of one-off efforts, aren't going to have the systemic, transformative, and sustainable change that we want to happen. So Spotlight hits the issue from every angle. It works directly with governments to get them to budget more money for this issue, but also to change their existing policies and laws. Works with different ministries who have influence on this, like education, healthcare, justice. We invest heavily in civil society and have a core foundation of leaving no one behind. So we really interrogate who are especially marginalized in a group and who are not receiving care or whose voices are not being heard. And we really emphasize elevating that space for them. And then, of course, we ensure that every person who experiences an act of violence has adequate support in whatever way they want and need to ensure long-term protection.
That's really amazing to hear. Gender-based violence is referred to as a silent pandemic, and more recently, a shadow pandemic. Can you tell us what do these terms mean and what do they suggest about the problem?
Yeah, great. I mean, silent pandemic, because we know that there's still so much shame in the space of a survivor and how a survivor is responded to, but also how a survivor might internalize their own abuse. There's a tremendous amount of shame and stigma that remains. Even in countries I come from, the United States, honestly, even here, there's a real tendency to victim blame and to ask, well, what were they doing that might have brought on this abuse? And it feels like something that we should be beyond that, but truly we're not. And it's been really clear with COVID, and the reason it's called the shadow pandemic is that this was a pandemic that did rise in the shadow of COVID. So COVID was making the headlines, but behind that, there were many people locked indoors with abusers who had no ability to get help during lockdowns, during restrictions on services, when whole countries and societies were focused on life-saving interventions around COVID. There was this other pandemic, the shadow pandemic, happening in people's homes that was much, much more difficult to access and to be able to address. The most pervasive form of violence against women, of gender-based violence, is violence in the home, is domestic violence or interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, and that is incredibly hard to address. Many families still consider that to be a very private issue, something that is dealt with privately. In some countries, marital rape of a spouse, is not illegal. And in fact, some women in these countries would say, well, it's okay, he's my husband, he married me, so this is my responsibility. And if he wants to have sex with me, he can do so by force. These are the pervasive attitudes that we really need to focus on if we're hoping to get wide-scale change in this area, and why looking at the shadow pandemic specifically and looking at the same investments we're putting into mitigating the impacts of COVID into preventing and eradicating the pandemic of the abuse of women and girls is so essential.
Yeah, I feel that dimension of COVID-19 should also be highlighted. Thank you so much for highlighting them. 1 in 3 women in the world are affected by violence, and this statistic is often referenced in discussions about violence against women. Could you elaborate on what exactly this statistic captures and provide more context? What does it mean that 1 in 3 women will experience violence? What are the implications?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Well, first of all, that's the tip of the iceberg. Data on violence against women and girls is terrible. It's really hard to capture in any systemic way. And often what we have is what's been reported. And we know that what's reported is just the very tip of the iceberg of what's actually happening. So 1 in 3, first of all, needs to be recognized for what it is, which is not a very representative number, an underrepresentation of the actual issue. But if you just take the data, if you just take 1 in 3 on its face value, that means that of every 3 women and girls you know, 1 of them has been abused. 1 of them has suffered some form of gender-based abuse in their lifetime. That is a massive number. It means that all of us, male, female, non-binary, whatever our orientation, knows somebody who has faced gender-based violence in their lifetime. This is not an issue that affects people in other parts of the world or in other homes or at other socioeconomic levels. This is something that affects every single part of our society, our communities, our countries. And so I think the implications of that statistic are just that if you had a statistic like, 1 in 3 children will never learn how to read, or 1 in 3 men will never be able to get a job. These are really big numbers that need to be considered with the same weight that we think of other development indicators, other things that we take really seriously when we're considering when there needs to be a deep intervention to make sure that societies can function.
Yeah, I mean, 1 in 3 women being faced with violence is a very, very terrifying statistic in itself. And I feel that it is not talked about enough too. And I'm glad that today's Girl Talk is actually highlighting that. And actually, the Spotlight Initiative, where you serve as the head of the technical unit and senior technical advisor, is the world's largest targeted effort to end all forms of violence against women and girls. So can you tell us about what type of strategies are effective in eliminating gender-based violence?
Great. I mean, what excites me the most about the Spotlight Initiative is the fact that it allows for us to be really comprehensive, to cast a very wide net in how we're doing this work. So we're able to draw these red lines between our interventions. So if you have an intervention that's seeking to reach young people, you can do work with the Ministry of Education. You can do work with Ministry of Youth or Genders to get them to prioritize action in this area at the same time that you're doing direct interventions with in and out of school youth, and you're mobilizing youth-led civil society to have a stronger voice and advocacy with direct funding going to them. So not just in a voluntary capacity, but actually giving real money to these grassroots groups to have a voice for change. And that I think is really essential. So the recipes for Spotlight success are multifolded. So one, give money to this issue. I cannot state that strongly enough. If you give money to this issue, we can do something with that money that will have a real impact. Two, engage the government, but engage them at a fairly high level. Make sure you're getting those political commitments that will allow anything to be sustained. Three, be coordinated. Make sure that you're working across multiple sectors and you're talking to each other. It seems like a small thing, but it doesn't happen enough. Make sure you know what's going on and where the gaps are, and you can adequately fill those gaps. Four, invest deeply and meaningfully in civil society, particularly in women and girl-led civil society. And in the Spotlight Initiative, we have three tenets of our work with civil society around accountability, transparency, and meaningful engagement. And what that means is that we are working toward very organically ensuring that these voices are defining the program, monitoring the program, holding us accountable for delivering the program, and then getting the investments that they need to be able to sustain themselves without having to rely on this piecemeal funding that they're so used to getting, that is so essential or so detrimental to their very existence.
That's really amazing to hear. And I know that a lot of people will learn a lot from the strategies that you just mentioned right now. You've also been very engaged in advocacy efforts throughout your career. So what advice do you have for young, passionate change makers who want to address gender-based violence, both locally and globally?
Great. I mean, what you're doing now is incredibly impactful. The fact that you've organized locally, you've organized around something that actually already has a high level attention. You've mobilized for something that sits deep in your heart, but also makes you angry, makes you want to have change. I mean, that's an incredibly passionate place to start. I would say that for these youth movements, there was a period when I thought, the best thing you could do would be to connect with your kind of elder movements, your feminist movements who've been doing this work for 20 years or more. And I still think that's important. I think there's a lot to be learned from each other. But increasingly what I've seen from youth activists is that it's not actually essential, that you have an incredibly powerful voice just on your own without needing the legitimacy that an elder women's rights group might give you. So own that voice and don't be afraid to embrace your passion and your intelligence. You are experts in the field in your own right by your lived reality. You do not need to get a master's degree to be able to be an effective advocate. You are already doing it. Don't be quiet, don't be afraid, but be connected, have a community, because your community is what's going to save you. Have those people who always have your back and who will always stand with you as you fight for the causes you believe in.
Yours just really inspired me right now, and I'm definitely sure that all the young change makers watching this right now will definitely feel the same way too. Thank you so much for highlighting so much important stuff today about gender-based violence. I learned a lot from you, and it was so great having a chance to talk with you.
Priscilla, I think you're amazing. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I cannot wait to see what she's going to become. But if she can somehow become half the activist that you and your fellow Girl Up girls and advocates are, then I will know I've done my job well. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you to all of you for this amazing space that you occupy. It's essential. I truly believe that you all are the future, and you will ensure that we stay on track to have a much better world for everyone who comes after us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Thanks to both of you. Thank you, Priscilla and Erin, for that conversation and providing so much more context about the facts and the figures that we hear quite often associated with gender-based violence, as well as great information about effective programming and interventions. So thank you both for that. And I wanted to emphasize just one point that Erin made one more time, worth repeating, and that's that you are experts in your own right because you can speak to your lived experiences. Next, I'd like to pose another poll question to our viewers. And this one is, how can we help end gender-based violence? There are 4 options there. You'll see listen to and believe survivors, know the data and demand more of it, call for more and better services for survivors, or all of the above. And I'll also mention that this by no means is an exhaustive list. There are several ways to take action, as you've heard throughout our conversations with the speakers today. And I am so glad I see everyone responding with all of the above. Indeed, all of the above and more. What I'd like to do next is, last but not least, introduce Navya, an undergraduate student at the University of Delhi and founder and club leader of Girl Up Sahar. Along with her club, she has undertaken advocacy projects centered around several different issues, including but not limited to COVID-19 relief, menstrual equity, gender-based violence, mental health, and she has reached, along with her club, 9,000 individuals. Truly remarkable. We'll hear more from Navya about how her and her club are taking action.
Hi, my name is Navya. I'm a Girl Up club leader from India. My club began addressing gender-based violence through a digital campaign which focused on the different forms of the issue and provided ways to tackle each of them. We also explored various topics which have gender-based violence at their core. To spread awareness, we created a hashtag, No Excuse for Abuse, and even urged other organizations to use it. Financial and legal literacy sessions were conducted by experts. On the international front, we collaborated with Girl Up clubs from Mexico, Istanbul, and Morocco for informative discussions. In our storytelling campaign, members of the club cited various incidents from personal experiences or experiences of those around them. Currently, we're meeting each week virtually to conduct activities from Girl Up's enhanced gender-based violence curriculum. We believed it was crucial to cover gender-based violence as it remains a global crisis worldwide. It is a public health issue, along with being an issue of human rights violation. But despite its global prevalence, it often goes unseen and unnoticed, and as a result, survivors are frequently stigmatized and subjected to reliving trauma, which can deter them from reporting abuse. Inaccessibility of redressal mechanisms, normalization of the issue, and structural inequalities are the key challenges in taking action against gender-based violence. To tackle these, my club uses online resources and literacy drives to overcome the social stigma and equip our audience with guidance on preventive measures against violence. Recently, we also compiled a resource booklet with contact information of several legal and mental health professionals to bridge the gap between the survivors and the system. Another internal challenge that we face is regarding the nature of the topic of gender-based violence. since it is an issue that can often provoke intense feelings and induce triggers. We conduct grounding techniques and exercises for the emotional well-being of our members. So clubs that want to use social impact skills like organizing or advocacy to combat gender-based violence can follow a three-plank approach while planning their campaign. As a first step, educate the members of your club about the issue and its various facets. Conduct in-house sessions and discussions to facilitate the conversation. These members will further spread awareness in their communities, which will create a chain reaction of change in the society. Secondly, collaborate with like-minded organizations. Engagement and conversations with different Girl Up clubs can broaden our understanding of other sections and perspectives. Moreover, it can also help increase impact and help us reach out to a diverse set of people. What we can accomplish as an individual or as a club is magnified exponentially when we include other like-minded groups to join us in our activism. Lastly, hold the local authorities accountable by identifying loopholes in the system and drafting recommendations. If feasible and if safe in your region, conduct awareness drives on ground for the less privileged sections of the society. Along with that, fostering a sense of belongingness and cooperation amongst the members goes a long way. Develop a collaborative dialogue with your club regarding how to empower each other in order to create a safe space. Thank you.
Thank you, Navya, for sharing your insights and the initiatives of your club, providing 3 very important points for engagement for those that want to engage with their clubs as well. And thank you to you all, viewers, for joining us today for this very important topic. I would like to pose one final question. You might have seen it in the chat. That question was, how will you take action against gender-based violence through advocacy, fundraising, organizing, and or storytelling? So as we complete this Girl Talk and come to an end, I'd like for all of you to reflect on that question and continue to think about how you will take action. I would also like to remind all of you here with us today that you can get involved, and on this platform you'll actually see a section titled Getting Involved. So please take a look at that section of the platform and the links that are embedded there. I invite all of you to take the November Club Challenge, which you'll see there, and to take a look at the newly released curriculum. Let's talk about gender-based violence, building awareness and solidarity, which you can also find linked in that section. Today is the first day we've made this resource available, and we hope that you begin using it to inform your discussions and your advocacy to address gender-based violence. Thank you again to all of you for joining us, and take care.